Something about the first round of the college football playoff seemed unbalanced. In reality, this was the 8th time in the 11 years of the college football playoff where the first round has had an average margin of victory of more than 19 points. 2017 is the only year in which there wasn't a game decided by more than 20 points in the entire playoff. But we were promised a whole new playoff, so why is it more of the same results? Sure, you could say the problem is the teams the committee picked or that the first round games were all home games, but I think it comes down to one structural issue as the biggest reason for the imbalance in the first round, and that's the conference champions getting the top 4 seeds. Through whatever negotiations they did for this new format between the conferences and the bowls and whoever else had a seat at the table, probably Disney and Dr. Pepper and some other rich guys, the number 9 and the number 12 team got to leapfrog the entire field and get a bye in the first round. And the bye is not the problem. It's how the reseeding affects the rest of the field and the matchups that we got to see. Because if the bracket was based purely on rankings, aside from Clemson being let in because they're a conference champion, the first round would look like this. Notre Dame would host Clemson in the 5-12, with the winner facing Penn State in Atlanta for the Peach Bowl in the second round. 6 and 11 would be Ohio State at home against Arizona State for a chance to play Texas, probably in the Fiesta Bowl, just kind of guessing where they would put these people in the quarterfinal rounds. Tennessee would get SMU in the 7-10 for a spot in the Sugar Bowl against Georgia. And the most interesting matchup, in my opinion, and seeding-wise, would be the 8-9 with Indiana hosting Boise State for a shot at the Rose Bowl against my Ducks. I think it would be even more interesting if that was played at Boise State, and really, Boise should be ranked above Indiana, as well as a few other teams if we're really talking about it. But I digress. So on paper, and according to the committee themselves, remember, they did these rankings, we would get much more even matchups than what we actually saw this past weekend in the first round. So the solution seems pretty simple, but let's work backwards and hammer down how big of a problem the reseeding is, not only for the first round, but for the rest of the tournament going forward. Let's start with Texas, who is the most obvious example. I kind of touched on this in my video last week, but Texas has the easiest path of any of the teams for the first 2 rounds of anybody in the playoffs. They get a start at home with the number 16 Clemson. They're the team that snuck in this year. And then they get to face ASU in the second round, who's the second lowest ranked team, and they get to travel half the distance that Arizona State has to get to the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. Putting the merit of their number 3 ranking aside, I mean, look at what Penn State did and look at what Ohio State did in the first round compared to what Texas did with a much lower ranked team. How is it that the power brokers in college football devised a system in which the 3rd highest ranked team plays 16 and 12 back-to-back with home field advantage in both games, yet the number 1 team plays number 6 and the number 2 team plays number 5 in their first playoff matchups? And I know, Allstate, Chick-fil-A, and Tostitos are to blame for these negotiations, but the ACC, the Big 12, and the G5 are going to be the ones that end up regretting this particular part of the negotiation. Because, in my opinion, if ASU and Boise State can't even keep it close against Texas and Penn State, which they might do, they might not, SEC and the Big 10 have even more ammunition to say, we don't need anybody else. We have all the best teams in our conferences, so let's just go off and make our own playoff. Fuck these other guys. And as much as it sucks, we have to use this year to learn that not all power conferences are created equally. And like I talked about in my Notre Dame video, if we're going to keep this playoff, the one that's the championship for all 130 FBS teams, then there needs to be a more scientific and transparent way of ranking these teams that accounts for the schedule imbalances, not just from conference to conference, but from teams within the same conference. And it cannot just be strength of schedule. That is such a flawed metric. There needs to be another stated metric that we're using that can actually compare the differences in schedule from team to team. If we're not doing that, then we're just doing the same old thing that we were doing with the BCS and with the newspapers just selecting a winner years before that. Me, however, I'm not just doing the same old thing. I'm always evolving. So make sure that you like and subscribe as we're closing in on being monetized by the end of the year. Here's to a 2025 where we're bigger, better, stronger, and maybe richer.
I'll be a living God!
All right, so the other part of this reseeding equation is SMU and Penn State. And in my last video that I referenced earlier and that none of you watched, I talked about Penn State needing to win this first round game more than anybody else after a decade of coming up short under James Franklin in real meaningful games. They did that. they did that and more, actually. They had the biggest victory of the first round, points-wise. Their prize for that is getting to go from the 11th ranked team to the 9th ranked Boise State Broncos, who are the G5 representative this year. So just to kind of square it with the conversation we had about Texas, Penn State, who's the number 4 team, gets to face number 11 and number 9 back-to-back, albeit the second round they're not really getting home field advantage, but the first round they did. And number 1 Oregon has to face number 6 Ohio State, and number 2 Georgia faces number 5 Notre Dame. When you look at both of these examples, not only are we seeing a structural problem that could affect any year, right? We're looking specifically at this year, where the losers of the Big Ten and the SEC championship game are being rewarded for their losses in those games in a way that's directly detrimental to the teams they lost to in those said championship games. And remember, there was talks when we first started seeing those ESPN brackets, when the CFP rankings started coming out, that the 5th seed would be the best seed to start. Look at where Texas is at. Yeah, they might have to play the number 1 seed overall, but the Ducks have to play Ohio State, who for most of the year was a top 4 ranked team. And let me just put a scenario out there for you that very well could have happened this year and see how chaotic it all could have come down to, okay? Let's say Indiana beats Ohio State, they're undefeated, their only loss ends up in the Big Ten championship game. Penn State's only loss is to Ohio State. Ohio State's only loss is to Oregon. Oregon goes undefeated. So then you have an undefeated regular season and Big Ten champion Oregon. You have an undefeated in the regular season Indiana with their only loss in the Big Ten championship game to the number 1 team in the nation. You have a 1-loss Penn State. You have a 1-loss Ohio State. All of those teams, their only losses were to top 4 teams. Let's say Texas ended up losing to Texas A&M and then beat Georgia in the SEC championship game, right? None of this happened, but this was the closest scenario that we could get to what the bedlam would be. Those 4 Big Ten teams would have to be ranked 1 through 4. Maybe there's an argument for Notre Dame, but I don't think that Notre Dame would be ranked higher than a 1-loss Ohio State. They were not ranked higher than a 1-loss Penn State. And I don't think they would be ranked above a championship game loss Indiana that only lost to the Ducks. 3 conference champions would then have to be bumped up. The SEC champion, probably still Boise State, and probably still Arizona State. They would displace Indiana, Ohio State, Penn State, and Notre Dame. Probably still Tennessee. How is that scenario so close to happening with the setup that they agreed to? What's the point of the rankings then if you're just going to bump teams down because of conference champions? It just doesn't make sense how many of these weird quirks were baked into the first year of this new format. I think that it comes down to 3 probably equally plausible reasons that this happened. So the first one is that the people in charge are clueless and have no foresight of what's to come with college sports. And I think this actually might really be the answer. Like, I think that we're looking at the Kodak situation in the 90s where they just couldn't get off film. They couldn't see a way where they would move off the model that's made them money in the past long enough to understand that that's not going to be what works in the next 10 years. But even though I think that's the answer, let's entertain the other 2 just to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. So secondly is I think there's too many cooks in the kitchen. We kind of talked about who is at the negotiating table earlier on in the video a couple times. And they all have different goals. So the product that we get at the end is this mismatched compromise. And we kind of have proof of this. For example, a lot of the reporting when this new format was originally announced, I think late 2022, was about how the Rose Bowl was the organization that almost tanked the whole new format because they were not going to be able to be guaranteed their traditional New Year's Day game. And if what we're doing is chasing the most perfect way to choose a champion for the FBS, how is it that the thing that's holding it up, or the thing that even has any say in what would be going on, is lining up the timing of a game with a parade that's been going on for 100 years? Like, the more I talk about it, I think that all 3 solutions are all 3 answers are probably combined into one. Because that's the same thing. We're talking about the Rose Bowl needing to line it up with the parade that they've done. We're talking about not being able to get your head out of your ass long enough to realize college football doesn't give a shit about the Rose Bowl parade. It's about the game on TV. You're going to have 170,000 people there, 80,000 people there. You're going to have 30 million people watching it at home. So that brings me to number 3. And this is kind of a point that I touched on, and I'm going to reference an old video again that I talked about the rankings in the Notre Dame video, is that the true goals of the CFP and the rest of the college football postseason brass is not the same as what they're telling us that they are. Because as much as they're telling us that they're bringing college football into the 21st century, into the new era of sports, it looks a lot more like they're scheming up a way to rebrand the same old thing and serve it up as a new thing. The reason they're doing that is because the same old guys need to find a way to stay in power. Because the real change makers in college football and college sports in general right now, over probably the last decade, have been the courts. It hasn't been anybody in the sport. It's specifically, we're talking about the Ed O'Banion case, about NIL, and House versus NCAA, which is going to go into effect in 2025. And that concerns the revenue sharing between the schools and the increasingly obvious misnomer student athletes.
Student athletes. Oh, that is brilliant, sir.
They're white knuckling to try to hold on to any semblance of power they have as this thing goes way out of their control. It's kind of a weird way that this video kind of snaked through these points, but truly the point of this video here is that trying to make everybody happy in these negotiations with these kind of half-step things, for example, the one round of home games, or guaranteeing a spot in the playoff for the G5, and the conference champion being reseeded, it's going to end up being the stuff that blows this whole thing up. And for me, I've basically just been talking about college football, doing research about college football playoff over the last month, 2 months, and the more and more I get into it, the more and more it seems like this first version of this new format, it's looking like a last-ditched effort to try to save some semblance of a college football that is past. Whether they know it or not, this train is off the tracks. I mean, in the 2000s, we were talking about how the BCS was going to change college football, but that was just the conferences and the NCAA and the Bulls kind of fighting over power. This next year, we're going to have multiple guys on $10 million NIL deals playing for Duke or Michigan, not even the biggest players right now. And they're going to be having kids signed to contracts directly to the schools. This is way different than what we expected it to be. And that's not even to mention that there's a real possibility that the SEC and the Big Ten break off and make their own football league that would be bigger than probably the NBA. So the CFP, whatever power they have, they are pissing it down their leg with this lackluster first round they got from this half-ass format they put together for this year. So while the rest of this playoff is going to be exciting, we're going to get some good college football games, and hopefully the Ducks can pull it off. But it's kind of like watching 2020 or 2021 sports, where the change that the leagues made to kind of make things work in COVID and just kind of threw spaghetti at the wall, because this format is temporary. And the real game here is trying to figure out what's going to be next, not just for the playoff, but for the whole of college football. And what winning that game looks like is making sure that your team doesn't get left behind like Oregon State or Washington State did in this last bout of conference realignment. Because being left out in these current changes might mean that you're watching your games on the Roku channel come 2026. Thanks for watching that video. Hope you liked it. Make sure that you like and subscribe and leave a comment if you've watched this far. If you would like to watch more of my videos, on this side, I've got the video that I was talking about with the CFP rankings and where Notre Dame fits into all that. Up here, I've got my most popular video, over 11,000 views at this point, talking about the conference realignment and the SEC specifically. Other than that, on this side, we've got our subscribe link, and we'll catch you next time. See ya!